Stroud, and I'm 43 years old. And what I'm about to describe happened in my own neighborhood, on a street I have lived on for 11 years, at an hour when I should have been asleep and would have been asleep if my dog had not needed to go out. The street I live on in Irwin is a quiet residential street, older homes, mostly working families. The kind of neighborhood where people leave their porch lights on and know their neighbors by name. I have always felt safe on that street. I walk it every morning before school, and I know every house and every yard and every tree along it. At 2:30 in the morning on a Thursday in October, my dog woke me up needing to go out. This is unusual for her. She is 9 years old and has a reliable schedule, and 2:30 in the morning is not part of it. I put on shoes and a coat and took her out the front door and down the porch steps, and she went immediately to the edge of the yard and stopped. She would not go further. She stood at the edge of the yard facing the street, and she was rigid in the way that dogs are rigid when every part of their body is transmitting alarm, and she was not making a sound. No bark, no growl. Just that rigid, total attention directed at something in the street. I looked at the street. The street is lit by 2 street lamps, one at either end of the block. And in the middle of the block, the light is dimmer, but sufficient to see the road surface and the parked cars along it. There was something between 2 of the parked cars, about 40 feet from where I was standing. At first, I took it for a person crouching between the cars, the way a person crouches when they are looking for something they dropped. And my first response was confusion rather than alarm, because it was 2:30 in the morning and there was no reason for anyone to be between parked cars at that hour. Then it stood up. It stood up from between the parked cars, and it did not stand up to the height of a person. It stood up past the height of the cars, which are standard height sedans. And it kept going past the roofline of the cars, and it was still standing up when it reached a height that I estimated in that moment. And I've estimated many times since it's somewhere between 8 and 9 feet. It stood in the street between the 2 parked cars at that height, and it was oriented toward my yard. My dog made a sound then that I have never heard her make before or since. Not a bark. A single low sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a moan, and that she produced once, and then fell silent again. The thing in the street did not move. It stood at that height between the parked cars, and was oriented toward my yard, and I could not see its face clearly because the light at that point of the block was dim, and what I could see was a shape and a height and a stillness that was absolute. It did not move the way a person standing still moves. The small, continuous adjustments of weight and posture that a living person makes. It was still in the way that objects are still. I did not make a sound. I did not move. My dog did not move. We stood at the edge of the yard, and the thing stood between the parked cars, and I do not know how long we stood that way, but my estimate is between 2 and 3 minutes. Then it stepped to its left, 1 step, which took it out of the space between the cars and behind the car on the left, and then it was not visible, and I heard nothing from that direction. No footsteps, no sound of anything moving. It simply was there, and then it was not. I went inside immediately, and I did not go back out until it was light. My dog slept at the foot of my bed for the rest of the night without moving, which is also unusual for her. I told one colleague about this the following week, a woman who teaches 5th grade and who grew up in the northern part of Unicoi County on a farm, and who I trust to tell me things plainly. She listened to the whole account, and then she said that her father, who had lived his whole life in that county, had always said that the towns in this part of Tennessee had things moving through them at night that people did not see, because people were inside asleep when the moving happened, and that you only encountered them if something interrupted your sleep at the wrong hour. She said her father had called them passers, and had said they had always been in this country, and that they moved through the towns at night on routes that predated the towns, and that the best thing you could do if you saw one was exactly what I had done, which was to stand still and not make a sound and let it finish whatever it was doing. I asked her what they were doing. She said her father had never known, and had never tried to find out, and that not trying to find out was the appropriate response and the one that had kept him and everyone he knew safe. I still live on that street. I still walk it every morning. At night, I keep my dog on her schedule, and I do not go out after midnight. That is the only change I have made, and feels like the right one. Story 2, I cook at a diner in Hazard, Kentucky. Have been doing it for going on 13 years. Before that, I cooked at 2 other places in Perry County. And before that, I cooked at a cafeteria in Harlan. And before that, I washed dishes at a truck stop in Corbin until the cook there saw that I was paying attention and showed me how to do the work properly. My name is Otis Vanover, and I am 51 years old, and I have been getting up at 4 in the morning to start prep for the breakfast shift for most of my adult working life, which means I know what Hazard looks like at 4 in the morning better than most people who live here. At 4 in the morning, Hazard is empty. The overnight gas stations are open, and occasionally a truck goes through on Main Street, but otherwise the town is quiet and the streets are yours. I have walked from my apartment to the diner at 4 in the morning for 13 years, a walk of about 6 blocks. And in 13 years, I have had that walk to myself the vast majority of the time. The morning this happened was in late November, cold, the sky not yet showing any light, the streets dry and quiet. I was on my usual route, 2 blocks on Walnut left on Main, 4 blocks to the diner. I was on the Main Street section about halfway when I became aware of something behind me. Not a sound, not footsteps, an awareness. The specific quality of awareness that you develop when you spend a lot of time alone in empty spaces. An understanding that the quality of the empty space behind you has changed. I know this sounds vague, and I'm trying to be specific about it because I want to be accurate. It was not a sound. It was the absence of a kind of emptiness that had been there before. I turned around. About a block behind me, in the middle of Main Street, there was a figure. Upright, large, standing in the center of the road under a streetlight. The streetlight was doing me a disservice in this situation because it was bright enough to show me the figure clearly, and what I saw clearly was wrong. The figure was too tall for a person. I've been cooking in commercial kitchens for 30 years. And I have a very good spatial sense from years of working in tight spaces. And I know what a person looks like at a distance of 1 block under a streetlight. This was not that. The height was wrong and the proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the head too large for the body below it. It was standing still and it was facing me. I turned back around and I kept walking. I did not run. Running felt like the wrong choice in the same instinctive way that certain choices in a kitchen feel wrong before you can articulate why. I kept my pace steady and I walked the remaining 2 blocks to the diner and I unlocked the back door and I went in and I locked the door behind me. I looked out the small window in the back door. Main Street was empty as far as I could see. Whatever had been standing under the streetlight was gone. I made coffee and I started prep and I did not look out any window for the first hour I was in the diner. By the time the breakfast rush started at 6:30, I had mostly convinced myself of a series of things that were not true. That I had misjudged the distance and the height and the proportions. That it had been a large person standing in an odd posture. That 4 in the morning and cold air and an empty street had produced a perceptual error that my brain was now trying to correct with hindsight. I mostly convinced myself of those things, and then 3 weeks later, I was walking the same route at the same hour, and the same thing was under the same streetlight. Same position, same stillness, same wrong height and wrong proportions. And this time it was not facing away from me. It was facing me from the moment I turned onto Main Street, which meant it had either been watching the direction I was going to come from, or it had already seen me before I saw it. I turned around and took a different route to the diner. It added 8 minutes to my walk. I have been taking the different route for 2.5 years. I do not go on Main Street at 4 in the morning anymore. I have told no one in Hazard about this because I work in a small town and I serve the people who live here, and I do not need to be the diner cook who sees things on Main Street at 4 in the morning. I am telling it here because it happened twice, and because twice means it is not a perceptual error. And because I needed to exist somewhere outside my own accounting of my own morning walks. Main Street in Hazard at 4 in the morning has something that stands under the streetlights. I do not know what it is. I know it is there. I know taking a different route is the right decision. That is all I have and all I need. Story 3. My mother has run a small alterations and dry cleaning business out of a storefront in Grundy, Virginia for 34 years. I grew up in that store, did my homework at the counter after school, learned to hem pants and take in seams before I learned to drive. When I was 26, my mother's health started to decline, and I came back to Grundy to help her run the business, and I have been here since. I am 39 now. My name is Faye Morell, and the store is on a block of commercial buildings in downtown Grundy that has been there as long as the town has been a town. The building our store occupies was built in the 1930s. It has a front retail space, a back workroom where the alterations and cleaning equipment are, and a small storage area that connects to the building's shared alley behind the block. The alley runs behind all the buildings on this block and is used for deliveries and trash and the occasional shortcut. I know the alley well because I use it regularly when I am receiving supplies or taking out materials. What I want to tell you about happened in the storage area at the back of our building, which connects to the alley through a heavy metal door that we keep locked from inside. The storage area is about 10 by 12 feet, shelved on 3 sides, with a single overhead light on a pole chain. It is not a place I find interesting or unusual. It smells like cleaning chemicals and old cardboard, and it is exactly what a storage room in a 60-year-old commercial building should be. About 4 years ago, I was in the storage room in the late afternoon looking for a particular spool of thread that I had put somewhere in the previous week and could not locate. It was about 5:30, the store was closed. My mother had gone home. I was alone in the building. The storage room light was on, and the workroom light behind me was on, and the light was fine. I was on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, looking at thread spools, when I heard the alley door move. Not open. The handle moved. The specific sound of a door handle being depressed from the outside. That mechanical click and give of the latch mechanism. I heard it once, and then the door did not open because the door was locked from inside and the latch could not release without the interior throw being turned. I stood still and looked at the door. The door is solid metal and has no window, and I could not see through it. The handle was in its normal position. I listened. From outside the door, from the alley, I heard a sound that I have spent 4 years trying to find the right description for and have not found it. The closest I can get is the sound of something large adjusting its position against the outside of the door. A slow, sustained pressure against the metal, not a knock and not a scratch. A leaning pressure that made the door shift very slightly inward against its frame and then ease back. Once, then silence. I stood in the storage room with my hand on the pole chain for the light, and I did not move for about 4 minutes. Then I pulled the chain and turned off the light, and I stood in the dark storage room for another few minutes listening. Nothing from the alley door. I went back into the workroom, and I did not go back into the storage room that evening. I finished what I needed to do in the workroom, and I locked the front door and I went home. The following morning, I unlocked the front, went through the workroom, turned on the storage room light, and looked at the alley door. The door was exactly as I had left it, locked in place, normal in every visible way. But on the floor below the door, in the narrow gap between the door bottom and the concrete floor, there was a dark smear, a residue that had not been there the day before. I do not know what the substance was. I cleaned it up. I did not analyze it. I have not heard the alley door move since that afternoon 4 years ago. I still use the alley for deliveries and trash. The alley is an ordinary back alley in downtown Grundy, but I do not take the alley after dark, and I have had a second throw bolt installed on the alley door that requires a key from the inside as well as the outside, which means the door is not opening under any circumstances short of someone breaking the door itself. My mother asked why I had the second bolt installed, and I told her I had read something about commercial burglaries in the county, and I was being cautious. She accepted this. She does not need to know what I heard on the other side of the alley door. She is 71 years old, and her health is not good, and she does not need to know. I know. That is sufficient. Story 4. I fix furnaces and heat pumps and air conditioning systems for a living. Have done it for 22 years, the last 14 as my own business out of Wytheville, Virginia. The work takes me into people's homes and businesses at all hours, because heat systems fail at the worst possible times, which means I am frequently making calls in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, when somebody's furnace has died, and the temperature in the house is dropping. I'm used to moving through neighborhoods I know well at hours when those neighborhoods are dark and quiet. I know Wytheville pretty well after 14 years of service calls. My name is Clement Jarvis, and I'm 48 years old, and I want to tell you about a service call I made about 3 years ago on a cold January night that ended with me sitting in my work truck for 45 minutes before I could make myself drive home. The call came in at 1:15 in the morning from a woman named Beverly, who lived on a residential street in the eastern part of Wytheville, the older neighborhood up near the ridge. Her furnace had stopped working and the temperature in the house was already below 50. Standard situation. I loaded my truck with the equipment I would likely need and drove over. The street Beverly lived on was one I had been to before for a service call, maybe 2 years prior, a different address. It was a typical older Wytheville residential street, houses from the 40s and 50s, mature trees, the kind of street that looks a little different at 1 in the morning than it does in the daylight, but that is still recognizable as an ordinary residential street. I parked in front of Beverly's house and I was getting my tools out of the truck bed when I noticed something on the street about 3 houses down. Something was crouched at the base of a large oak tree on the tree lawn, the strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street, crouched low, close to the ground in the way that something crouches when it is making itself as small as possible. My first thought was a large dog that had gotten out and was hunkered down next to a tree. I looked at it while I was getting my tools, and it did not move, and I noted that it was larger than I initially assessed. Then I went to Beverly's door and I knocked, and she let me in, and I went to work on the furnace. The repair took about 45 minutes. A failed igniter, which is a common failure and not a complicated fix. Beverly made coffee and I drank a cup and we chatted about the weather and the town, and I finished the job and wrote up her invoice and we said goodnight and I went back out to my truck. The thing at the tree was still there. 45 minutes had passed and it had not moved. It was still crouched at the base of the oak tree 3 houses down in the same position, the same low crouching posture. I put my tools back in the truck bed and I looked at it more carefully than I had on the way in. The street was quiet, and the nearest streetlight was close enough to give me a reasonable view. And what I was looking at was not a dog. The shape was wrong for a dog, and the size was wrong for a dog. It was too wide through the body, and the head was wrong. Too large and positioned too low relative to the body. And the limbs that were holding the crouching posture were configured in a way that I could not make into any animal I had a confident name for. I got into the truck. I sat in the truck and I looked at it through the windshield. It did not move. In the time it took me to put my seatbelt on and start the engine and sit there with the engine running, it did not move. It was a cold January night, and the thing at the base of the oak tree 3 houses down was crouched at the base of that tree with the stillness of something that was not bothered by the cold and was not in any hurry. I drove away, not fast, at to normal speed. I did not look in the rearview mirror until I had turned onto the main road and the street was no longer visible. I went home and I sat in my truck in my own driveway for 45 minutes. The heat in the truck was running and I sat there and I thought about what I'd seen and I went through every animal I could think of and I eliminated each one, and I ended up in the same place every time, which was that I did not have a name for what was crouched at the base of that oak tree on that Wytheville street at 2 in the morning in January. I still do service calls on that street. I've been back to Beverly's house once since the following winter. Same issue, different part. I drove past the oak tree both times. There was nothing at the base of it in the daylight. Nothing at the base of it when I parked at 11 at night for the second call. I looked both times. The tree was ordinary. The street was ordinary. I just know what was crouched at the base of it the first time. And I know that 45 minutes passed, and it did not move, and it was not bothered by the cold of a January night in Wytheville, Virginia, and I do not have an explanation for any of that, and I have stopped looking for one. Story 5. The town of Williamsburg, Kentucky, is a small city in Whitley County, down near the Tennessee border. I have lived here my whole life. I manage the parts department at an auto dealership on the main commercial strip, and I am 44 years old, and my name is Thelma Pratt. I want to say before I get into this that I have never thought of Williamsburg as a particularly strange place. It is a small city with a university in it, and a decent downtown, and the usual mix of businesses and churches and neighborhoods that you find in any small Kentucky city. Nothing about it has ever struck me as unusual. What happened to me happened on a night in late August 2 years ago when I was walking home from a friend's house about a mile from mine. I walk that road regularly. It goes through a mix of residential and light commercial blocks, and I know it well, and have never found it anything but perfectly ordinary at night. I was about halfway home, on a block that has a couple of small businesses on one side, and a church with a large adjoining cemetery on the other, when something in the cemetery caught my attention. The cemetery is a historic one, old headstones, mature trees, a low iron fence along the street. At night, the interior of the cemetery is dim, but not entirely dark, because the streetlights on the road give enough light to see several rows of headstones into the interior. What I saw in the cemetery was movement. Something moving between the headstones in the interior, not along any path, moving through the headstones themselves, weaving between them in a pattern that was fluid and deliberate. My first read was a person, someone in the cemetery at night, which is unusual but not impossible. Vandals or teenagers, or someone visiting a grave for reasons of their own. But the movement was wrong for a person. A person moves between headstones by navigating around them, changing direction, choosing gaps. What I was watching moved through the headstones in a continuous fluid motion that did not involve navigation, as if the headstones were not obstacles to be navigated around, but simply features of the terrain it was moving through. As if it knew exactly where every stone was and had a path through them that it had used many times, and it was fast, faster than a person moving carefully between stones in the dark would move. The movement had the quality of something that had made these exact movements through this exact terrain many times and did not need to think about them. Automatic, like muscle memory expressed across a whole body rather than just hands or feet. I stopped on the sidewalk and watched it. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds as it moved through the cemetery interior, and then it reached the back of the cemetery where the property backed up to a wooded area, and it went through the fence at the back and into the trees, and it was gone. I stood on the sidewalk outside the iron fence for another minute or so. The cemetery was still. I could see the headstones clearly in the light from the street, and there was nothing moving among them. Whatever it had been was in the trees now, and I could not see it. I walked home, I went inside, and I made tea, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about what I had seen. What I kept coming back to was the quality of the movement, the specificity of it. The way it moved through those headstones without hesitation suggested it had moved through that specific configuration many times. It knew where every stone was. It had a path through that cemetery that it had used often enough to have internalized. That means it is a regular. Whatever it was, it uses that cemetery regularly enough that the layout of the stones is not something it needs to think about. It has a route through there. It has been coming to that cemetery for long enough to know it the way I know my own kitchen, by feel, without having to look. I walk past that cemetery 2 or 3 times a week, depending on my schedule for seeing friends. I look into the interior every time I pass. I have not seen the movement again, but I know that the absence of it does not mean the absence of whatever makes it. It means it is elsewhere, doing whatever it does in whatever other parts of this town it frequents, moving through them with the same fluid certainty that it moves through the cemetery. Williamsburg has something that knows the historic cemetery well enough to move through it in the dark without thinking about it. I do not know what else it knows that well. I do not know how many other parts of this town it has memorized. I live here. That is a question I find difficult to stop thinking about. Story 6. I am a home health aide in Raynell, West Virginia. This means I spend a lot of time in other people's houses in the Greenbrier County area, providing care for elderly and disabled clients who need assistance with daily living. I drive to multiple homes in a day, and my schedule often has me driving in the early morning and the late evening, before and after the daylight hours, on roads and in neighborhoods throughout the county. My name is Cornelia Doss, and I'm 37 years old, and I've been doing this work for 8 years. The work has given me a specific familiarity with the residential geography of this area, the neighborhoods and the houses and the streets, that most people who live here do not have, because most people do not move through as many different parts of the community as regularly as I do. Raynell is a small town, maybe 1,500 people, in the Sewell Valley between two mountain ridges. It is the kind of small town where everybody knows everybody's business, and where the community is tight, and where there are houses that have had the same families in them for 3 or 4 generations. I know many of these families through my work. About 2 years ago, I was driving to an early morning client visit, leaving my house at 5:45 in the morning for a 6 o'clock arrival, which is a time when Raynell is not quite fully dark because the sky is beginning to lighten in the east, but the streets are still dim enough to need headlights. I was on a residential street 2 blocks from my client's house when my headlights picked up something in the road. It was in the road. Not on the shoulder, not on the sidewalk. In the road. It was low to the ground, sprawled across part of the lane, and I thought immediately that it was an animal that had been struck by a vehicle. I slowed and stopped about 30 feet from it. My headlights were on it directly. It was not an animal that had been struck. It was not injured. What I was looking at was something that was on the road surface deliberately, lying flat on the road surface, with its limbs extended in the specific posture of something that is pressing itself against the surface rather than collapse onto it. There was a difference between those two things, and the difference was visible. The posture was active. It was pressing against the road with intention. The size of it was wrong for any animal I could name. It was approximately the length of my car, or close to it, and the width through the body was substantial. It filled most of one lane. While I was stopped with my headlights on it and my foot on the brake, it moved. The movement was a slow gathering of itself from the spread posture into a more compact form, the limbs drawing inward, the body rising slightly from the road surface. Not quickly. With the deliberateness of something that is not alarmed by the headlights and is not hurrying because of them. Rising from the road surface with the patience of something that has all the time it needs. When it had gathered itself, it was roughly oriented toward my vehicle, and I could see it more clearly in this position than I had when it was flat. And I want to be precise about what I saw, because I have been precise about it with myself for 2 years, and I want to continue to be precise. The head was large. The eyes, or what were in the position of eyes in the head, were not reflecting my headlights the way animal eyes reflect headlights. The reflection was wrong in color and in quality. A flat reflected light rather than the bright tapedo reflection that I have seen from deer and cats and dogs in headlights. It turned away from my vehicle and moved off the road to the left, toward a vacant lot between 2 houses, and it went into the vacant lot, and I could not see it in the darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I drove to my client's house. I provided care as scheduled. I drove home and I called my supervisor, and I told her I had seen a large animal on the road and that it had shaken me, and I had asked if I could start my afternoon clients at noon rather than at 10. She accommodated this without question. I have driven that street many times since. I have never seen it again on that street. 2 months after the first incident, I was driving a different street in Raynell, about 4 blocks from the first location, and I found something in the road that I initially took for debris, a large dark shape on the road surface that I went around carefully. When I went past it and looked in my rearview mirror, it was not debris. It was moving from the flat posture into the gathered posture in my headlights as I drove away. I watched it in the mirror until the distance and the dark made it invisible. Same behavior, different street, 2 months apart. Whatever it is, it uses Raynell's streets at night, and it lies flat on the road surface, and it gathers itself slowly when the headlights find it, and it is not in any hurry about any of it. I drive these streets every day and every morning in the dark. I have stopped being surprised by what these streets contain at hours when most people are asleep. I have started being careful about it in the specific way that you are careful about things you cannot change and cannot avoid, which is that you pay attention and you know what you see, and you do not stop in the road with the thing in your headlights any longer than you have to. Story 7. I want to say something about Bryson City, North Carolina before I tell you what happened to me there, because I think the character of the place matters. Bryson City sits at the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Swain County on the Tuckasegee River. It is a small town with a significant tourism economy because of its proximity to the park and the Nantahala Outdoor Center and the Great Smoky Mountains Railroad. In summer it is busy. In winter it is quiet, and it belongs to the people who actually live there. I am one of those people. My name is Bernard Talent, and I am 55 years old, and I operate a small kayak guiding and rental business on the Tuckasegee. I have lived in Bryson City for 20 years, moved here from Charlotte when the city stopped making sense to me, and the mountains started making more sense. I know the town and the river and the surrounding country intimately. The thing I want to tell you about happened on a winter night about 4 years ago, late January, when the tourist traffic was minimal and the town had the winter quiet that I've always loved about it. I was walking from my business on the river back to my house, a walk of about 1.5 miles, through the older residential section of town. I do this walk regularly. I know every yard and every tree on the route. I was on a street called Slope Street, which runs up the hillside on the north side of town, when I heard something above me. The houses on Slope Street are set into the hillside, some of them with the hill rising steeply behind them, and the street itself runs below the hill, with a wooded slope above the houses on the upper side. I heard something in the wooded slope above the houses, a sound of movement in the trees. And I want to describe this carefully because the character of the movement mattered. It was keeping pace with me. I was walking south on Slope Street, and whatever was moving in the wooded slope above the houses was moving south at the same pace. Not faster, not slower. Pace for pace with my walking speed, at a distance of maybe 30 or 40 feet up the slope from the street level. I stopped walking. The movement in the slope stopped. I started walking again. The movement started again. I did this 3 times. Stopped, the movement stopped. Walked, the movement walked. 3 confirmations of the same relationship between my movement and the movement in the slope. Whatever was up there was tracking my position and matching my pace deliberately. On the 3rd stop, I stood on Slope Street and I looked up the slope into the trees and I called out. I said hello and I said, "Is someone up there?" And I waited. From the slope there was no voice and no response that was language. What came back was a sound that I have not been able to put an accurate description to in 4 years of trying. Low and not quite rhythmic and not quite mechanical, and not quite biological in any biological category I have. And it lasted about 4 seconds and then stopped. I walked the rest of the way home at a pace that I'm not going to describe as anything other than what it was. I went inside and I locked the door, and I stood in the kitchen for a while before I could settle enough to sit down. I have walked Slope Street many times since. The woods on the hill above it are ordinary winter and summer, the ordinary mixed hardwood forest that covers the hillsides throughout Swain County. I have not heard paced movement again. I have not heard the sound again. But I know that on that January night, something was in those woods above Slope Street that matched my walking pace deliberately. And that when I stopped, it stopped, and when I walked, it walked, and that when I called out, it made a sound in response that was not language and not silence, and that I cannot find a category for. Whatever's in the hills above Bryson City in winter, when the tourists are gone and the town belongs to the people who live there, it knows the streets. It knows the pace of someone walking Slope Street at night, and when you stop and call out to it, it answers. I do not walk Slope Street after dark anymore. I take the lower route, which adds 12 minutes. 12 minutes is a small price and I pay it without regret. Story 8. My grandmother lived in Parsons, West Virginia for 62 years, from the time she married my grandfather until she passed 3 years ago at the age of 87. In that 62 years, she never moved, never lived anywhere else, and came to know Parsons and Tucker County in the deep way that people know places when they have never left them. She was a practical woman, not given to sentiment or exaggeration, and she had opinions about everything in that town and expressed them directly. My name is Shelby Compton and I am 34 years old, and I want to tell you about something my grandmother told me when I was visiting her in Parsons about a year before she passed. She was 86 and her health was declining, but her mind was entirely clear, and she had reached the age where she had decided to say things she had previously held back. She said she had been holding back this particular thing for about 40 years, and she was not going to die without telling someone who would take it seriously, and she had decided that person was me. She told me about a summer in the early 1980s when she'd been in her mid-40s and had been working evenings as a bookkeeper for a business in downtown Parsons. She would work late 3 nights a week and walk home after, a walk of about 8 blocks through the residential streets between the downtown and the neighborhood where she and my grandfather lived. She had done this walk for 2 years without incident. In the summer of that year, she said, she began to notice something on a particular block of her walk home, a block on Spruce Street that ran past a large, undeveloped lot that had once been the site of a house that burned down and had never been rebuilt. The lot had grown up with vegetation over the years, and at night it was a section of dark overgrowth on an otherwise residential block. What she began to notice, she said, was that the lot was not always empty in the way that empty lots are empty. On certain nights, not every night, but specific nights that she could not identify a pattern to, there was something in the lot. Not visible exactly, she said. Present. A quality of presence in the dark overgrowth of the lot that she became attuned to over weeks of walking past it. She said she could not see anything in the lot on those nights, but she could tell the difference between the lot when it was simply empty and the lot when it contained something. The way you can tell the difference between a room that is empty and a room that has someone in it, even before you have seen anyone. On the nights when the lot was not simply empty, she walked on the far side of Spruce Street and she did not look at the lot directly. She learned this response, she said, not from anyone telling her, but from instinct, from the specific instinct that tells you the appropriate thing to do in a situation you do not fully understand. This went on for 2 summers, she said. She walked Spruce Street 3 nights a week, and on certain nights the lot was not simply empty, and she walked on the far side of the street and did not look at the lot directly. On the last occasion, she said, was a night in late August of the 2nd year when she was walking home, and the lot had the quality of presence, and she was walking on the far side of the street with her eyes forward, and something happened that had not happened before. From the lot, from the dark overgrowth, she heard her name. Not shouted, not called. Said. Spoken at a normal speaking volume in a voice that she could not recognize as belonging to any person she knew. A voice that had the shape of her name, without the qualities she associated with any human voice she had ever heard. She walked home without stopping. She did not go back to the evening bookkeeping job. She told my grandfather she had found different work. She never walked Spruce Street after dark again in 40 years of living in Parsons. She told me this when she was 86 and had decided to say the thing she had held back. She told me because she said someone should know, and because she thought I would take it seriously, and because she said she had never stopped thinking about the way that voice said her name, and she wanted someone else to know that it had happened. I take it seriously. I took it seriously when she told me, and I take it seriously now. My grandmother spent 62 years in Parsons, and she was the most practical woman I have ever known, and she spent 40 years not walking a particular block of Spruce Street after dark, because something in an empty lot on that block said her name in a voice she had never heard before. I have visited Parsons twice since she passed. I drive through the Spruce Street block in the daylight, and it looks like any block in any small West Virginia town. The lot is still there, still overgrown, still undeveloped. In the daylight, it is ordinary. I have not been on Spruce Street at night. I do not intend to be. My grandmother was 86 years old when she told me this, and she was clear and certain, and she had held it for 40 years, and she was still holding the memory of the way her name sounded in that voice. That is recommendation enough for me. Story 9, I do tax preparation work in Abingdon, Virginia. Have my own small office, do individual and small business returns, work year-round on bookkeeping for a handful of clients, and then get buried for the 4 months around tax season. It is not glamorous work, but I am good at it, and I like the precision of it, the way numbers either balance or they do not, and there is no ambiguity in the result. My name is Percival Haynes, and I'm 47 years old, and I have been in Abingdon for 18 years, long enough to consider myself a local, even though I was born in Bristol. I live in a house on a residential street in the older part of Abingdon, the part that dates to before the Civil War, where the houses are close together and the yards are small and the trees are old enough to form a canopy over the street. What I want to tell you about happened on my own street, in front of my own house, at an hour when I should have been asleep and would have been asleep if I had not been working late on a complicated return during tax season. It was about 1 a.m. in early April, and I was at my kitchen table with the return spread out around me, and I looked up from my work and looked out the kitchen window that faces the front yard and the street. There was something in the street directly in front of my house. I want to describe what I saw as plainly as I can. It was standing in the street, upright, at a height that exceeded the height of the parked cars along the curb. It was facing my house. Its posture was the posture of something that had been standing there for some time, the settled posture of presence, rather than the alert posture of arrival. Whatever it was had been in front of my house for long enough to settle into standing. I looked at it through the kitchen window, and it faced my house. And I looked at the height of it, and I looked at the proportions, and I went through the list of things it could be, and I eliminated them one by one, the way I eliminate entries in an account that do not reconcile. I eliminated person because the height was wrong. I eliminated bear because the posture was wrong and the shape was wrong. I eliminated every animal I could think of, and I ended up in the same place I always end up in these exercises, which is with the remainder that does not balance. I watched it for about 10 minutes. It did not move. It stood in front of my house, facing my house with the settled posture of something that had been there a while. The kitchen window was illuminated behind me, which meant the interior light was visible from the street, which meant whatever was out there could see the lit window, could see me at the window, potentially. After 10 minutes, I moved from the kitchen window to the front room, which is dark, and I looked at it from the unlit front room through the front window. It was still there, still standing, still oriented toward the house. From the unlit front room, I could see it slightly differently, and the angle changed. And from that angle, I could see that the head was turned slightly, not facing the kitchen window anymore, facing the front window that I was behind and that was dark. It had tracked my movement from the kitchen to the front room. I moved away from the front window and went back to the kitchen table, and I sat down and I did not look out any window for the remainder of the time I was awake that night. I finished the return I was working on, which took about 40 minutes. And then I turned off all the lights in the house and went to bed. In the morning, the street was empty and ordinary. I went to work and I came home and I cooked dinner, and at no point during the ordinary day that followed did what I'd seen at 1 a.m. feel like anything other than exactly what it was, which was something in the street in front of my house that moved its head to follow my movement from one room to another. I do tax preparation work. My professional life is about reconciling numbers. What I saw in front of my house in April at 1 a.m. does not reconcile with any category I have. And I have learned in 18 years of doing meticulous work that when something does not reconcile, you have to accept the remainder, even when the remainder does not have a name. The remainder is something that stands in front of houses on residential streets in Abingdon at 1 in the morning and tracks the movement of the people inside. That is the remainder. I have not been able to balance it out, and I have stopped trying. Story 10. I have delivered mail in the town of Pikeville, Kentucky for 15 years. Rural delivery, a route that covers the residential streets in the older part of Pikeville and extends out into several of the surrounding hollows. I know every address on my route. I know the dogs on every property, and I know which dogs are theatrical and which ones mean it. I know which houses have good drainage and which ones flood every spring. I know the roads in the early morning before anyone else is on them, and I know them in the afternoon when the school buses are running, and I know what they look like when they are wrong. My name is Rosamond Bell, and I am 49 years old. And what I want to tell you happened not on my route, but in my own neighborhood in Pikeville, which is in the older residential section on the hill above the downtown. I walk to work in the mornings and walk home in the afternoons, and I have done this for 15 years. I know my neighborhood the way I know my route. 3 years ago in early September, I was walking home on an afternoon when the weather was still warm, and the light was that specific late afternoon light that comes in September in eastern Kentucky, low and gold and long-shadowed. I was on my street, maybe a block from my house, and I was passing a yard that belongs to a family I have known for years, a 2-story house with a deep backyard that backs up to a steep wooded hillside. I glanced at the yard as I walked past, and in the yard, at the base of the hillside at the back of the property, something was standing. At the edge where the maintained yard ended and the wooded hillside began. Standing upright and still, and at a height that was wrong for any person and wrong for any animal I could reliably name. It was in the shadow of the trees at the hillside edge, and the detail was limited, but the shape and the height were visible, and they were wrong. I want to be specific about this because I have had 15 years of professional training in noticing what is out of place on a residential property, and I know what out of place looks like. What was standing at the back of that yard at the base of that hillside at 4:30 in the afternoon was out of place in a way that was immediate and total. It did not belong to any category of thing that belonged in a residential backyard in Pikeville at 4:30 in the afternoon. I kept walking. I did not stop. I did not look back when I had passed the yard. I walked to my house and I went inside. What has stayed with me about this, more than the shape or the height or the wrong proportions, is the time of day. 4:30 in the afternoon. Not 2 in the morning, not in the dark, not in conditions that produce perceptual errors. 4:30 on a clear September afternoon in the specific gold light of late summer. Whatever I saw at the back of that yard was standing in clear afternoon light at 4:30. And it was there, and it was wrong, and it was real. I've walked past that yard many times since. I look at the hillside edge every time I pass. Whatever was there in September 3 years ago has not been there again in daylight, which I find significant in the way that absences are significant when you have already seen the presence. It was there once in the light. It was visible. And then it learned or decided or chose not to be visible in the light again. That learning, that adjustment, is what I cannot stop thinking about. The first time I saw it, it was in the afternoon light, as if it did not yet know or did not yet care that the light made it visible. And then it was never there in the light again. Something changed after that September afternoon, so some calculation was made, and the result of the calculation was that whatever uses that hillside above the residential properties in my neighborhood does not stand in clear afternoon light where it can be seen from the street. It knows that I saw it. I believe that. And it has adjusted accordingly. That adjustment is more frightening to me than the original sighting because it tells me something about what it is capable of understanding. And what it is capable of understanding includes me. Story 11. I work the night shift at a small hospital in Clarksburg, West Virginia. I am a patient care technician, which means I do vitals and patient checks, and assist the nursing staff with care tasks through the night. I have worked nights for 7 years, and I am accustomed to the specific character of a hospital at 3 in the morning, which is quieter than people who have not worked in hospitals at that hour might expect, and which has a particular quality of sustained attention that is different from the alertness of a busy daytime shift. My name is Florentine Archer, and I'm 32 years old. And what I want to tell you is not about the hospital. It is about the neighborhoods surrounding the hospital, which I walk through at the beginning and end of each shift, and specifically about something I have seen on my walk home twice in the past year. The hospital is on a block that is surrounded by a mix of older medical buildings and residential streets. The residential streets in the immediate vicinity of the hospital are a mix of houses from different eras, some large Victorian-era homes that have been converted to offices, and some that are still residences. The streets are well lit because of the hospital proximity, and I've always found them safe and unremarkable at any hour. The first time I saw it, I was walking home at the end of a night shift, around 7 in the morning on a summer day with the sun already up and the neighborhood beginning to get active with people going to work. I was on a residential street 2 blocks from the hospital when I saw something on the roof of a large 2-story house on the corner. On the roof. On the peak of the roof, crouched, facing the street below, large. Too large for a person, and shaped wrong for a person. In the morning sun, on a residential street in Clarksburg. Crouched on the peak of a roof and facing the street below and not moving. I stopped on the sidewalk and I looked at it directly. I want to be clear that it was daylight and the sun was fully up, and I had been working all night. But I was not impaired in any way that would produce a significant perceptual error. What I was looking at was real, and it was on the roof of a house on a corner in a residential neighborhood in Clarksburg, West Virginia, at 7 in the morning. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for probably 30 seconds. It was crouched on the peak of the roof with a stillness that was absolute, the same absolute stillness I have described before, and that I recognize now as the particular stillness of something that is watching rather than resting. It was watching the street below it. It was, from the orientation of its head, watching me. I continued walking. I went home and I slept. And when I woke in the early afternoon, I thought about what I had seen on the roof, and I went through the options and I eliminated them in the way that I always do, and I was left with the same remainder. The second time was about 8 months later in the spring, same shift end, similar morning light, a different street, about 4 blocks from the first location. Same thing. Crouched on a roof peak, same stillness, same watching quality. Different house, different street, same thing. 2 sightings on rooftops in the residential neighborhood around the hospital. I have worked night shifts at this hospital for 7 years, and I have been walking these streets at shift end for 7 years. And these are the only 2 occasions on which I have seen this, which means either it is new to the neighborhood or it is not new to the neighborhood, but something changed that made it visible. I have thought about this and I have not been able to determine which is more likely. What I do know from 7 years of night shift work in a hospital is how to observe and document accurately under conditions of fatigue, because patient care in a hospital at 3 in the morning requires exactly that skill. And what I observed on those 2 mornings, on those 2 rooftops, I observed accurately. It was there, both times. It was real. I still walk those streets at shift end. I look at the rooftops more than I used to. I have not seen it a 3rd time. I'm not sure whether the not seeing is comfort or information or both. Story 12. The town of Burnsville, North Carolina, is the county seat of Yancey County, and it sits in the Black Mountains at about 2,800 feet elevation. It is a small town with a historic downtown and a strong arts community, and it is surrounded by some of the highest peaks in the eastern United States. I've been here for 11 years, moved from Asheville when the rent situation there stopped making sense for a person on a school teacher's income, and I have never regretted the move. I teach art at the high school, and my name is Georgia Munn, and I am 42 years old. The account I wanted to give is from 2 winters ago when we had a particularly cold January with significant snowfall, the kind of winter that makes the high elevation character of Burnsville very present in daily life. During that cold January, I was working late at the school several nights a week, preparing for a student exhibition and walking home afterward. a walk of about 10 minutes through the downtown and then into the residential area where I live. The downtown of Burnsville at 8 or 9 in the evening in January is very quiet. The restaurants close early, the galleries close early, and the foot traffic is minimal. The snow on the streets and sidewalks was packed down by that point in the month, and the walk home was cold, but not difficult. On a Tuesday evening, I was walking home through the downtown, and I passed through the central square, which has a small park area at its center, with benches and plantings under snow. I was crossing the square when I saw something on the far side of the park area, between two of the larger trees. Standing between the trees, partially behind one of them, in a posture that conveyed the specific quality of concealment, the posture of something that is positioned behind an object, in a way that is deliberate rather than accidental. The tree it was partially behind was a substantial old maple, and the thing was using it the way a person uses a door frame when they are looking around a corner. The portion of it visible around the edge of the tree was enough to establish that it was tall, much taller than the tree trunk diameter that it was partially concealed behind, and that the portion of the head that was visible around the tree edge was oriented toward me. It was watching me cross the square. It was watching me from behind a tree in the central square of Burnsville, in the snow at 8:30 on a Tuesday evening in January. I crossed the square at a normal walking pace. I did not break stride. I exited the square on the far side and walked the remaining 4 blocks to my house at the same pace, and I went inside. The following evening, I was walking home the same route, and I crossed the square and I looked at the 2 trees where I had seen it. And the trees were ordinary trees in a snowy park, and nothing was between them. The 3rd evening, same thing. Nothing. The 4th evening, I was not working late and took a different road. I crossed the square on the subsequent working late evenings that January, and nothing was between the trees again. Whatever had been there on that one Tuesday was there on that one Tuesday, and not on other occasions, which is a pattern that I have tried to find significance in and have not been able to. Not regular, not daily, not every time the conditions are similar. Just once, that one Tuesday in the snow, behind the maple tree in the central square. The specificity of once is different from regularity. Regularity implies a behavior pattern. Once implies a moment of something being between those trees on that specific evening, in that specific snowfall, on that specific Tuesday. A moment that I happened to cross the square during. A moment that would not have been witnessed at all if I had been 10 minutes earlier or 10 minutes later. I teach art. I think about observation and what it means to see something, and what it means to have been in the right place at the right time to see it. What I think about the square in January is that I was in the right place at the right time to see something that is not often visible, and that does not repeat its visibility at predictable intervals. I was there and I saw it. I'm glad it was behind the tree rather than in the open. I think about that when I cross the square in January now. I am glad it had chosen the tree. I do not know what it would have been like if it had been in the open. I have decided not to find out. Story 13, I run a small bait and tackle shop in Sophia, West Virginia, which is a community in Raleigh County that most people from outside the county have not heard of. It is a working community, not a tourist destination, and the people who come into my shop are mostly locals who fish the Guiandot tributaries and the surrounding streams, and who have been doing it their whole lives. I've been running the shop for 9 years, and before that I worked at a larger sporting goods store in Beckley. My name is Wendell Cutright, and I am 56 years old. The thing I want to tell you about happened about a mile from my shop, on a back road that runs alongside one of the creeks, at a time when I was checking on a section of creek bank, where I had permission to fish. This was in the early evening in late October, not yet fully dark, but the light going. The sky still orange in the west and the shadows deep in the creek hollow. I was on the creek bank looking at the water, checking the flow and the clarity after some rain the week before, when I heard something on the far bank. The creek at this point is maybe 30 feet wide and shallow, and the far bank is steep, rising quickly into wooded hillside. What I heard from the far bank was not an animal sound in any category I recognized. It was a sound that I wanted to describe carefully because getting it right matters. It was rhythmic and low, and it had the quality of intentionality, which is my way of saying that it sounded like it was being made on purpose rather than being a byproduct of something else. The way a bird call is made on purpose versus the way a branch falling makes a sound is a byproduct of falling. This was made on purpose. The rhythm of it had a pattern that repeated with a consistency that random environmental sounds do not have. And it was coming from the far bank, from the steep wooded hillside rising from the far bank of the creek. I stood on my bank and I listened to it. It went on for about a minute and a half. Rhythmic, low, intentional, coming from the hillside across the water. Then it stopped. In the silence after it stopped, I heard something on the hillside move. Not toward the creek, up the hillside, moving away from the water and up the slope. And the movement was fast, very fast. The sound of something large moving up a steep wooded hillside at a pace that was inconsistent with how difficult that terrain was. It was up the hillside and over the ridge and gone in about 20 seconds, and then the hillside was silent. I stood on the creek bank until the light was fully gone. Then I walked back to the road and drove to the shop and locked up and drove home. I have a professional relationship with the outdoors that 25 years of fishing and running a bait shop produces. I know what belongs in creek hollows and hillside forests in Raleigh County. The sound I heard from that far bank did not belong to any category I had for that terrain. And the speed of movement up that hillside when it left was wrong for any animal I can name. That terrain is steep, and that speed was not possible for any animal that moves through terrain, the way animals move through terrain even. Something was on the far bank of that creek in the hollow outside Sophia, making a sound that had a rhythm and a pattern, and that it was making on purpose. And when it was done making it, it went up a hillside at a speed that steep wooded terrain should not permit. I still fish that creek. The water is good and the fishing is good, and nothing has happened at that site since. But I fish it in the daylight now, and I do not go to the creek bank in the evening when the light is going. Some things that happen at a particular place do not mean that place is lost to you. They just mean that the hours are different now. The daytime hours are still mine. I've accepted that the evening hours belong to whatever was on that far bank. That is a reasonable accommodation, and I have made it. Story 14. My great-uncle Amos lived his whole life in the town of Richlands, Virginia, which sits in Tazewell County in the Clinch Valley. He was born there in 1931, and he died there in 2019 at the age of 87. And in 87 years, he never lived anywhere else, and probably never wanted to. He was a coal miner for 30 years, and after that he grew a garden and kept chickens and fixed things for neighbors, and went to the same church he had gone to since childhood. My name is Trudy Ahrens, and I am 48 years old, and I grew up in Richlands and moved away to Roanoke when I was 22. But I came back regularly to see family, and specifically to see Amos, who was my grandfather's brother and who I had always been close to. In the last years of his life when his health was declining, I visited more often, and I spent a lot of time sitting with him on his porch in the evenings and listening to him talk. In his last year when he was 86, he told me something that he had never told anyone in his family, or so he said. And I believe him because he was not a man who withheld things without a reason. And the reason he had withheld this for 60 years, he told me, was that he did not think anyone would believe him, and that in Richlands in the 1950s, a coal miner who said he had seen what he had seen on a particular street in town would have been told that he needed to stop drinking. He was not a drinking man. I want to establish that before I relay what he told me. In the summer of 1958, when he was 27 years old, Amos was working the day shift at the mine and walking home in the late afternoon. His route home took him through several blocks of residential Richlands, streets he had walked his whole life. On one of these streets, he saw something standing in a side yard between two houses, in the narrow corridor of space between the houses, and he described it to me in terms that were specific and consistent with what I have heard from others. which is why I'm including his account here, even though I did not witness it myself. He said it was tall, taller than the eaves of either house, which put it at 14 or 15 feet by his estimate, because those were old houses with 8-foot ceilings, and the eaves would have been at around 10 or 11 feet, and what he saw was taller than the eaves. He said it was in the side yard, and it was oriented toward the street, and he saw it as he was walking past, and he stopped on the sidewalk and looked at it. He said it had no expression that he could read, that he could not read it the way you read a face, and that it was looking at the street and at him, but the looking was not like human looking because it had no quality he recognized. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at it, and it stood in the side yard and looked at the street and at him, and they looked at each other for what he said was probably half a minute. And then it turned and went through the side yard toward the back of the houses, and he could no longer see it. He said it walked without making a sound. The side yard had gravel on it, and he heard no sound from the gravel. 14 or 15 feet tall, and no sound from the gravel. He said he had walked past that address every working day for years, and had never seen it again. He said he had never understood whether that was because it had been there many times, and he had simply not been in the right position at the right moment to see it, or whether that afternoon in 1958 was the only time it had used that side yard. He said he did not know, and had not tried to find out. He told me this in 2018 when he was 86 and had decided, as people sometimes do at that age, that there were things that needed to be said before the opportunity was gone. He told me because he said, I had always been the one who would listen to unusual things without making him feel foolish. I hope I honored that. I have been back to Richlands twice since he passed. I have driven past the address he described, which he told me precisely. The house is still standing, different owners, nothing unusual about it in the daylight. The side yard has gravel on it still, or gravel that has been replaced over the decades. Ordinary gravel, no mark of anything. Whatever was in that side yard in 1958 stood on that gravel in silence at 14 or 15 feet of height and looked at the street and at a 27-year-old coal miner who stopped on the sidewalk and looked back at it. And then it walked through to the back of the houses without making a sound, and was not seen again in 60 years of my great-uncle walking that street. 60 years. He walked that street for 60 years after that afternoon, and he never saw it again. I think about what that means, whether it moved on, whether it was always there and he never happened to see it again, whether the one time he stopped on the sidewalk and looked directly at it rather than walking on was the variable that made the encounter singular, whether looking directly at it and stopping was the thing that changed the terms. I do not know. Amos did not know. He walked that street for 60 more years, and it was just a street, and he was just a man walking to and from work and living his life. He lived his life. He had 87 good years in Richlands, Virginia. He just knew for 60 of those years what he had seen in a side yard on a summer afternoon in 1958. He knew it and he carried it, and he told me at 86 because he did not want to take it with him when he went. I have it now. I am putting it here. That is the appropriate next step. Story 15. I've kept a garden in Paintsville, Kentucky for 31 years. The same garden, behind the same house, on the same street, where I've lived since my husband and I bought the house in 1993. My husband passed in 2014 and I've lived here alone since, and the garden has been a constant through all of it, through every season and every personal change. I know that garden the way you know something you have tended for 31 years. I know what it looks like at every hour of the day and in every season and in every kind of weather. My name is Loretta Couch, and I am 62 years old, and what I want to tell you happened in my garden on a night in July of last year. I was awake late, which happens more often now that I live alone than it did when my husband was alive. And I had gotten up for water, and I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard and the garden. I do this sometimes on sleepless nights. The garden is a comfort to look at even in the dark. The familiar shapes of it, the rows I have tended for 3 decades. There was something in the garden. I want to describe this plainly. In the garden, in the rows of tomatoes and pole beans that I've been growing in that specific configuration for years, there was something crouched between the rows, low to the ground, between the rows of plants, in the posture of something that is examining what is growing there. Looking at my plants, my first thought, as it always is in these situations, was an animal. A deer in the garden is not unusual in Paintsville, and a deer will browse garden plants readily. I turned on the back porch light to spook it. The back porch light is strong, a 100-watt equivalent LED that I installed because I sometimes work in the garden in the evening and I need good light. When I turned it on, it fully illuminated the backyard and the garden, and the thing crouching between the rows. It was not a deer. It was large, and it was crouching between my tomato rows with what I can only describe as attentiveness, the specific posture of something paying close attention to what it is looking at. The porch light hit it fully, and it did not startle the way a deer startles when a light comes on. It stayed in its crouching posture, and it turned its head toward the house, toward the light, toward me. I was looking at it through the kitchen window with the porch light on it, and it was looking at the house, and I do not know if it could see me through the glass from that angle and distance, but I had the complete certainty in that moment that it knew I was there. We looked at each other, or we were in positions that implied looking at each other, for about 30 seconds. Then it turned its head back to the garden, and it continued doing what it had been doing, which was examining the plants, moving slowly between the rows, low to the ground, attending to the garden. I stood at the kitchen window, and I watched it do this for about 2 minutes. It moved through my garden rows with what I can only call careful interest, attending to the tomatoes and the beans and the cucumbers, moving with a deliberateness that suggested it knew what it was looking at, that it was familiar with what garden plants were and was examining mine specifically. After 2 minutes, it moved to the edge of the garden and then to the back of the yard, where the yard borders the alley, and then it was in the alley and gone. I turned off the porch light and I stood in the dark kitchen for a while. Then I went back to bed. In the morning, I went into the garden before I did anything else. I went through every row. Not a single plant was damaged. Not a leaf disturbed. Not a stem broken. Not a fruit or vegetable taken or marked. Whatever had been in my garden in the night had moved through it carefully and had not damaged anything. I have thought about this more than anything else about the encounter. The care, the lack of damage, the deliberateness of movement through the rows. Whatever was in my garden was not there to eat or to destroy. It was there to look, to attend to the plants, to examine what was growing in the rows of my 31-year-old garden in Paintsville, Kentucky. I do not know what information it was gathering or what purpose it serves. I know that my garden was examined thoroughly and carefully and left undamaged, and that whatever examined it moved through 31 years of my tending without disturbing a single thing I had grown. There is something in that which I cannot decide whether to find comforting or not. I still keep the garden, the tomatoes and the pole beans and the cucumbers in the same rows they have always been in. I tend them every day. On some nights when I cannot sleep, I look out the kitchen window at the familiar shapes of the rows in the dark. Whatever came to my garden that July night has not come back, as far as I've been able to tell. But I tend the garden knowing that it was examined once and found worth examining by something that knew what gardens were, something that moved through mine carefully and took nothing. I leave the porch light off on nights when I cannot sleep. I do not know if that makes a difference. I have decided it cannot hurt. These 15 people have been carrying these 15 accounts for years. That is what this channel exists to be, the place where the carrying can stop. If these stories are why you came back to Park Ranger Files, then we need you to do something. Like this video right now, and leave a comment telling us which account stayed with you longest. Subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you are here when the next batch drops. What we have coming in the backlog is some of the most genuinely unsettling material this channel has ever received, and we do not want you to miss it. Every submission that comes into this channel is read personally. If something happened to you in your town, on your street, in your neighborhood, at an hour when you should have been asleep or in the light of an ordinary afternoon, the submission link is in the description. Tell it plainly. Tell it the way it happened. We will handle the rest. Thank you for being here tonight.